When Jesus went to the synagogue to speak for the first time, synagogue in Capernaum, I believe, when he went into that synagogue, there were people in that synagogue who kept the Sabbath day and who knew God. There were also people in the synagogue on that day who kept the Sabbath day and did not know God. It's something to kind of get your mind around and hard perhaps to understand, but Jesus could not have been clearer on this particular matter. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the sages were variously labeled by Jesus himself as liars and murderers, and he categorically said, "You have not known God." Now, that was not true of all Pharisees or all Sadducees or all of these people, but it was true of a very large number of them, of those who were in confrontation with Jesus Christ. But these men were, nevertheless, to use our term for it, Sabbatarians. Their Sabbath keeping was not pleasing to God. Do you suppose the same thing could be true of people today? That there are people today who observe the Sabbath and their hearts are still far from God. There are people who keep the Sabbath and they know God, even as there were at that time. Is it possible that for some people the Sabbath is merely a doctrine? It's an idea. It's a way to be right while other people are wrong. I keep the Sabbath and you don't. Is that what it becomes for people? Is it an icon of superiority? Is it something of that nature? Is it possible that the Sabbath is for some people merely a good idea, something to believe, something even to practice at one level, but not necessarily something that helps shape our lives? Now, it's not hard to figure why God gave man the Sabbath day. If you worked hard all week and Friday night sundown comes around, you realize you don't have to work for the next 24 hours. The reason for the Sabbath becomes immediately apparent. The body needs rest. The mind needs rest. We need downtime. We need time for thought. We need time to be able to stare off into space and think about the things that have happened to us all week long. So it's not hard to figure out why God gave us the Sabbath day. It's a little harder to figure out why man has so much trouble with it. Israel, you know, went into captivity for breaking the Sabbath day. And yet, through their history, they theoretically were a society that kept the Sabbath day. Now, when you think about it, if we in the United States today had hard and fast Sabbath laws to where everybody in the country observed the Sabbath day, how hard would it be to keep the Sabbath? To take off work, go to church on Saturday, to do those things that we normally would think. How hard could it possibly be living in a society that kept the Sabbath day? What's interesting about this, too, is it didn't take them any time at all to have a problem. If you'll turn back to Ezekiel chapter 20, I want to show you what I mean. Now, I'm going to Ezekiel, who is a prophet. But at the same time, the incident he is talking about is history. It is something that goes way back in time. And he wants to use it to underline a current problem. In Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 10, "Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt, and I brought them into the wilderness. And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he will live in them." Now, this is not hard. This is not difficult. This is simply a statement that here is a set of laws. Here is a way to live your life. If you live your life this way, it will work. Life will go well for you. These are the things that give you an edge in the world. He says, so keep them. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that does sanctify them. Or more specifically, I gave them my Sabbath to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am Jehovah that does sanctify them. In other words, I gave them the Sabbath so they might know me, and they know me by my name. It's connected. It's all part. They will know who their God is and not someone else. Now, I take it that the word Sabbaths in the plural includes not only the weekly Sabbath as an institution, but the other annual Sabbaths as well. Note well that the Sabbaths are a sign of who God is by name. Continuing in verse 13. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They walked not in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man do, he will live in them. And my Sabbaths they greatly polluted. Then I said, I would pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness to consume them. Now, what Ezekiel is telling us here, long after the fact, is that this became a huge problem before they ever entered the Promised Land. They were given all the laws, the statutes, the judgments. They were given the whole 9 yards at Mount Sinai. And then they went off into the wilderness for 40 years. And in that 40-year wandering in the wilderness, they lost track. They would not keep. They turned away from and were disobedient to God's law. Now, as I said, this is strange. How hard can it be to keep the Sabbath day when everybody's keeping it? Especially in the wilderness. What in the world are you going to do to break the Sabbath in the Israelite camp about 40 miles north of Mount Sinai on the way out into the Promised Land? When everybody around you is sitting in their tent or sitting under the tent flat, when people are standing around talking about God, when people have no work to do. In fact, not only do they have no work to do, no work is allowed to be done. You got to think about that for a while. You know, for many of us have had to struggle with that question. We live in a non-Sabbath keeping society. And sometimes it's a question of whether you can hang on to your job or whether you're going to lose your job to keep the Sabbath. These people didn't have those problems. Didn't have them at all. They had a Sabbath-keeping society, a Sabbatarian administration, and they still couldn't keep the Sabbath day. They did not merely, by the way, pollute the Sabbath. It tells us they greatly polluted the Sabbath. Verse 14. But I worked for my name's sake, that it would not be polluted among the heathen in whose sight I brought them out. What he's saying is this: I didn't do with you what I might have done because for my own name's sake, for my reputation, I didn't want people to be able to say, well, he brought them out of Egypt so he could kill them in the wilderness. He couldn't get them to the Promised Land. God couldn't get it done, so, their God must not be that big a deal. I did it. I saved you for my name's sake. But I also lifted up my hand to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land that I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments, walked not in my statutes, but polluted my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. In the wilderness. Think about it. In the wilderness. Now, I sort of always thought the reason they didn't get to go into the Promised Land was because they were afraid. They came back with a bad report, and they said, no, let's turn around, let's go back to Egypt. And because they were fearful, they were afraid, and they wouldn't go forward, that God says, okay, you're going to wander out here and die off in the wilderness. But this adds a new dimension to it. He says, they despised my judgments, they didn't walk in my statutes, they polluted my Sabbaths. These are the elements that were involved at that time. Furthermore, he said, I spared them from destroying them. Neither did I make an end of them in the wilderness, but I said to their children in the wilderness, don't walk in the statutes of your fathers, don't observe their judgment, don't defile yourselves with their idols. Now that's an interesting connection he just made there, because he has made a connection between the Sabbath and idolatry. That is, between the failure to keep the Sabbath, the polluting of the Sabbath, and idolatry. Now, where would that come into the picture? Well, he had just said, I gave them the Sabbath so they would know that I am Jehovah who makes you a holy people. The Sabbath is that sign of who I am. And so consequently there would clearly be a difference or distinction to be made between Sabbath observance and idolatry in opposition to it. The alternative of choice is between the Sabbath and idolatry. Well, they went on into the land finally. And even once they were in the land, once they had themselves established in the land, they had a king, they had an administration, and in theory, the Sabbath was the law of that land, they still had trouble with the Sabbath. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 19. Jeremiah 17, verse 19. Thus saith the Lord to me, go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, where the kings of Judah come in, and go out in all the gates of Jerusalem, and say to them. Now the prophet was said he was the investigative reporter of the day. He was the one that told the truth to power. And so he goes to the place where the people of power assemble, and he stands there as a preacher in public, and he's to tell them this. Hear the word of the Lord, you kings of Judah, and all Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem that go in and out by these gates. Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day. Don't bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Don't carry it out of your houses on the Sabbath day. Don't do any work, but hallow you the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. Now, you would think that that was a relatively easy thing for them to do at that time, under those circumstances. Here's the question. Why didn't they? Why were they unable to bring themselves to do that? Why did they continue to break the law? He says they obeyed not. They wouldn't incline their ear. They made their neck stiff that they wouldn't hear nor receive instruction. It shall come to pass, if you diligently hearken to me, saith the Lord, to bring in no burden to the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, if you will hallow, that is, keep it holy, the Sabbath day, simply to do no work therein, then there shall enter into the gates of this city kings and princes sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This place shall remain forever. What a promise. Just keep the Sabbath day, folks. Don't do any work. Don't come out of your house carrying a whole big load of stuff that you're going to go out and sell somewhere. Don't do that on the Sabbath day. Just relax, take the day off, and rest. They shall come, he said, if you do this, from the cities of Judah, from the places around about Jerusalem, the land of Benjamin, the plain, the mountains, the south, bringing burnt offerings, sacrifice offerings, meat offerings, incense offerings, and bringing sacrifices of praise to the house of the Lord. This is what I expect you to do. But if you will not listen to me to hallow the Sabbath day, to not bear a burden, then I will kindle a fire in the gates of the city, and it will devour the palaces of Jerusalem, that it shall not be quenched. They didn't, and it did. They didn't keep the Sabbath day, and the fire did burn the gates of Jerusalem. And here, the prophet, under direction of God, makes it very, very clear that the Sabbath day was the key issue in what took place. It wasn't some climb every mountain, ford every stream. It wasn't, where is God that we can go bring him down, or where is he down here that we go bring him up, as you borrow from Paul. It wasn't any of that. Keep the Sabbath day. This is where we start, because this is where we know who God really is on the Sabbath day. Well, by the time Israel returned from exile, they had the lesson of the Sabbath straight, sort of. I've often heard people say that's one lesson that Israel really learned in the captivity was the observance of the Sabbath. But by the time they got back, they were an interesting example of the futility of enforcing the Sabbath. Because by the time they get back, okay, fine, they know when the Sabbath is, they're observing the Sabbath in their way and after their fashion, but the real lessons of the Sabbath they do not yet seem to have absorbed. They've come a certain distance, but they still don't get it. They have become the enforcers of the Sabbath. There's a part of me that understands that. When you understand where they had been, what they'd been through, and the reason the prophets told them for it, it was a little bit threatening to them to see someone being a bit careless about the Sabbath day, so they built a fence around the law. They would start the Sabbath 30 minutes earlier, a half hour or so early. They ended a half hour late. And, of course, then they had all sorts of rules and regulations about how much you could carry out of your house, what you actually had to do if your house was on fire. They had regulations and rules for just about everything you could have about the Sabbath day. Never seeming to understand that the Sabbath day is, and always has been, a matter of the heart. It has to do with what's going on inside of you, not so much what you do with your hands, even though that's not unimportant. Matthew chapter 12. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But the Pharisees saw it, and they said, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day." Now, you know what they're doing, don't you? It's really a very simple thing. They're walking a distance. They took a shot across a corner of a field, and they reached down, and they grabbed a handful of grain, brought it up in their fingers, and pushed it around, and then popped it in their mouth and chewed on it as they walked on their way. To the Pharisees, this was not only breaking Sabbath day, It was something that they felt the need to enforce about the Sabbath day, to call into question, to demand something be done differently about this. And it was a major issue in their minds that they were doing this small thing. Now, why was this a factor? Well, any fool should know that if you're going to keep the Sabbath day, you're not going to get all your people together, all your reapers out, your sickles and so forth, and go out and reap your fields on the Sabbath day. We all should know that. Even we should know that you shouldn't go out there and reap a quarter of your fields on the Sabbath day. We all know that you shouldn't go out and reap a corner of them on the Sabbath day. And their question was, where do you draw the line in plucking these things and just one at a time? Well, is 2 okay? And if 2 are okay, then 3. And if 3 are okay, then 4. And the hair splitting begins. Now, one of the things you do have to understand about enforcement is that whenever you decide you're going to enforce a law, you have to draw lines. There is nothing mystical or sacred about 55 miles an hour as opposed to 53 or 58. There's nothing that special about 70 miles an hour as opposed to 67 or perhaps 74. These are merely lines, bright lines that legislatures have drawn in order to give them something they can enforce. And so the Pharisees, they drew the line on the observance of the Sabbath day at 1 ear of corn. They drew all these lines so tight that a person really couldn't do much of anything on the Sabbath day without coming a cropper or being accused of breaking the Sabbath day by the people that were involved. And it was not just a matter of strictness. They had come to the place to where they felt it was an obligation of theirs to enforce the Sabbath day. And once you decide to enforce it, well, then you have to draw lines and have to set rules and have to make rules to explain your rules, and so on it goes. But Jesus replied, "Didn't you read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Now this raises, at this point, the interesting question of exceptions to the Sabbath law. What does Jesus mean when he brings up the situation of David and the showbread? One, he says categorically it was not lawful for David to eat it. So, it was wrong. At the same time, he seems to be implying contextually that no blame was going to attach to David for having done so on this occasion. Now, how can it be wrong and no blame attach? You see, when you fall into that way of thinking, you're thinking like a Pharisee. You're thinking like an enforcer. The truth is, it is a matter of the thoughts and the intents of the heart. That was probably the only time in David's life he ever ate the showbread in the temple. Why? Because it wasn't lawful for him to eat, don't you understand? And yet on this occasion, no blame attached to him because it was unusual circumstances, they had to have food, and there was nothing else to eat. Now, that's not really difficult to understand if you understand that the Sabbath is a matter of the heart, and that God looks on the heart, and that our righteous judge does not judge us by the same kind of standards, sometimes even that we judge ourselves. Then there's the other part of this. The priests on the Sabbath day profane the Sabbath in the temple and are blameless. Now, if I were to ask you, which is the greater law, the Ten Commandments or the ceremonial ritual law, which would you say? You'd say Ten Commandments, wouldn't you? Okay. Now, here's then your question. Why is it then that a ceremonial law takes precedence over the fourth commandment? You follow me? The priests actually broke or profaned the Sabbath because the Sabbath doesn't allow the killing and butchering of animals on the Sabbath day. But the ceremonial law required the priests to kill, butcher, and so forth these animals on the Sabbath day, and according to Jesus, it took precedence. They profaned the Sabbath, but were blameless because they were doing the work of God. They were carrying out, in fact, and they were working out on the stage of the temple, the plan of the gospel. Because, in fact, the entire symbolism of sacrifices, of offerings, all had strong Christological implications and had to do with salvation. Okay, Now, all these things are exceptions to the Sabbath rule. And there are exceptions to the Sabbath law. But they are exceptions, not the rule. And this is the thing all of us have to work on in our hearts and minds. What makes the difference? It is a matter of the heart and of the intent. And no one but God can judge the heart. No one but God can judge the intent. So how on earth can we possibly create a situation where we enforce the Sabbath? Now, to be true, if we were a Sabbath-keeping society, we probably would have laws that regulated some things. We would see to it that stores were closed on the Sabbath day. You couldn't open, couldn't do business. They've done that in the past because they're Sunday laws. You couldn't open your businesses on Sunday. You couldn't sell clothes on Sunday. You couldn't do any of those things. Well, we got rid of all that, and now it's 7 days a week that we can do these things. It's a matter of the heart, though, when it comes to living in the world we live in, as to what you're going to do or what you're not going to do, and whether or not something that comes up is an exception or whether it is not. If one breaks the Sabbath in an emergency and then returns to Sabbath observance, he can be as blameless as the priests. After all, the Sabbath is between you and your God. Who is your God? What does He think about your exception to the law? Don't worry about what I think. Don't worry about what other people think. This is a question between you and God. You have decided on this occasion, I'm going to make an exception. I'm going to do this on the Sabbath day. What does God think about what you are doing? Is this a careless exception for your own convenience or desire? Or is it a reasoned decision made with God's guidance? In Exodus 20:34, verse 21, it says, 6 days shall you work. The 7th day you shall rest. In earing time and in harvest you shall rest. This one verse is all I'm reading to you on this one. Exodus 34:21. 6 days you shall work. On the 7th day you shall rest. In earing time and harvest you shall rest. Why did he say that? Because of the temptation to decide that earing time and harvest are exceptions, and I've really got to get out there and get this work done because I only have a certain amount of time to get the harvest in. He says, no. These aren't exceptions. These aren't emergencies. These are things that can be planned for. These are things you know are coming. You have absolutely know when earing time is going to be. You know when harvest is going to be. So let's get all the stuff done. Let's get prepared for it. These are not emergencies. So whenever you translate this into your life today, you have to realize that life does go on, and there are things that you know are coming. You have got to make plans. You've got to prepare for stuff. And just because you have some urgency, just because you have something that's important in your business life, in your farm, or whatever you're doing, that doesn't mean that you have an exception to the Sabbath day. That there are times when you have to plan and work around it. And so he goes on to say, in earing time and harvest, these are not emergencies, they're not exception. Inventory in your business, for example, would not be an exception. You know you're going to have to do it. It's a seasonal thing. You know when it's got to take place. And therefore, you should plan, and you shouldn't be working at that type of thing on the Sabbath during those times. Now, returning to Jesus' comments. He continued having said what he said about the Sabbath, I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. That follows on the heels of the statement. The priests profane the Sabbath in the temple and are blameless. He then said, but there is in this place one who is greater than the temple. What he just said was temple sacrifice can actually, take precedence over Sabbath observance. And I am even greater than the temple. Well, that's a stunning statement that he just made here. It's an astonishing statement for any man to make to a group of Jews in that day and at that time. And there is one greater than the temple. If you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. What a statement he just made here. What he is saying simply is this. If you want to understand how to keep the Sabbath day, listen to me. I am the Son of Man. I am the Lord of the Sabbath day. He will tell us that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath, it cannot be lightly set aside, but at the same time, it should not be a to us. It should not be shackles and chains. It shouldn't be something of that nature. And we need to ask ourselves, when it is that way, why it is that way. Verse 9. When Jesus departed out of there, he went to the synagogue. and there was a man with a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? So they could accuse him. Now this one to me, I guess I'll grow old and die. I'm halfway there. I've already grown old, and I'm going to die one of these days. Without knowing how on earth you could interpret the law to say that to say to a man, be healed, is work. That a man, here's a man in the synagogue with a withered up hand like this. I was fascinated by this particular example because of the vividness of it. And you say to the man, stretch out your hand like the other, and he stretches it out and it becomes whole like the other. How can you interpret that as a violation of the Sabbath day? But they did. They did interpret it that way. He then says, they watched him to see if he could heal on the Sabbath day. He said to them, What man is there among you that shall have one sheep? And if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, he will not lay hold and lift it out. All right, I got that. That's easy. That sheep has fallen in there. It's a poor animal. We care about animals. And, we basically go out there. We don't want the poor thing hurt. If we lifted a sheep up to put him somewhere to shear him on a weekday, that's work. But if we're pulling him out of a pit, doing exactly the same work, using the same set of muscles and everything on the Sabbath day, to get the sheep out of a hole, it's not work. Or, if it is work, it's blameless work before God. Just like the priests who profane the Sabbath in the temple are blameless. You get your sheep out of there, it's work, it's breaking the Sabbath, but it's blameless. You're not held accountable for that. There's a funny thing about this. Paul will ask the question later, does God really care about animals? You get the impression from this that he does. Paul says, not really, he doesn't. And when you really get down to it, the sheep is money. You think about it, the sheep is money. But he goes on to say, how much better is a man than a sheep? So it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. So he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. He stretched it forth, and it's restored whole like the other. Now, if I had been there on that day, I don't think I'd have had a single hair lying down on my body. Everyone would have been standing straight up. When I saw that man that I knew had been in this synagogue, and I felt sorry for him and his poor withered arm, and I saw him stretch that arm out and just watched it before my eyes become as whole as the other one. Man, gooseflesh is a mild statement for how you would have felt. What was the response? The Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. Now, to some people, this would have been a commendable zeal for the Sabbath day. But you should know something. It had nothing whatever to do with the Sabbath day. What it had to do with was power, with control. The enforcement of the Sabbath was part of the power structure of the religious establishment. Understand? The enforcement of the Sabbath was a part of the power structure of the religious establishment at that time. And therefore, they could not allow these continued exceptions to the Sabbath to be made by Jesus. It threatened their power. Now, I want to tell you something else that's strange. Throughout the time when the apostles were alive and working, the entire Christian church continued to observe the Sabbath on the same day as the Jews. I think I've demonstrated that adequately in a book that I have titled The Christian Sabbath Day. I think many people probably haven't read it because they think they know what I'm going to say in the booklet and they already believe in the Sabbath and they're not worried about it. But you don't know unless you've read it what I was going to say. Well, the apostles died. And by the time the next generation was gone, perhaps the majority of Christians walked away from the Sabbath day. Think about that. Throughout the entire first century, really, the entire Christian church throughout the whole known world observed the Sabbath day on the same day as the Jews. And within a generation of the time when the last apostle had died, the last of the witnesses of Jesus was gone, the majority, probably, of the Christian church at that time left the Sabbath day entirely and stopped observing it. History repeats itself. Israel walked away from the Sabbath day. In the wilderness. Then when they got into the land, they walked away from the Sabbath day again in a Sabbath-keeping environment. Now we have the church who once again, having kept the Sabbath day through all of its history up until that time, kept the Sabbath, now they walk away from it. What is it about this day that causes people to decide they're going to abandon it and walk away from it, just like the Israelites had done before them? Why? Well, I think Samuel Bakioki in his book From Sabbath to Sunday offers a believable theory. But human nature being what it is, I think the reasons were probably more complex than that. One reason may have been a reaction against the unnecessarily restrictive enforcement of the Jews. And you think about this for a little while, and when you see a church, for example, that has a terribly restrictive enforcement of the Sabbath upon its membership. Now, they wouldn't have the same kind of enforcement, let's say, that a civil government would have had in ancient Israel. But nevertheless, the threat of expulsion, the threat of isolation, the whatever threats there may be that a church could bring to bear, a church that had a really restrictive attitude and policy toward the Sabbath day, do you think that would have any influence on the next generation, the children that grew up in the church and then went on into life after that? Well, the Jews were still around, and that enforcement attitude was there at this time. Another reason may have been that it was harder for Christians to keep the Sabbath in a Greek and Roman society, because the Greeks and Romans did make some allowance for Jews. But if you were a Christian, you were not a Jew. If you were a Gentile Christian, you were not a Jew. And to the Romans and the Greeks, that type of exemption didn't apply to you because you are not a Jew. Therefore, you couldn't get the Sabbath off in the way that perhaps a Jew might have been able to get it off. And of course, it may have been all of the above. It may have been the Jewish restrictiveness in Sabbath observance that led some Christians, as generations came by, to consider the Sabbath a yoke of bondage. And to this day, I shake my head in amazement whenever I encounter people who want to make that argument. Think about it. God tells a man to take a day off from work. Lay down your yoke. We're not going to work today. And men come along and say, no, that's a yoke of bondage. Giving men a day off from work is a yoke of bondage. Well, work is a virtue. But we have a saying that sometimes you can turn a virtue into a vice. And in the modern world, we have done that in this country with work. We have taken work, a virtue, and in many cases we have turned it into a vice because we can't seem to stop working. I mean, look at it. It's incredible. This country now has become easily the most productive in the world. Our people work harder. More people hold down 2 jobs. Sometimes 2 people in the family both hold down 2 jobs. I don't know what sometimes we think we're working for, but nevertheless, people are working their heads off, and it has become very much a vice. Now, all this taken together leads me to wonder, though, even so, how easily some people would lay aside the Sabbath day without enforcement and without any pressure, still lay it aside. It happens. And I wonder to myself, why? And again, I might ask then, why do we who do keep the Sabbath, why do we abstain from work on the Sabbath day? Now, of course, God commanded it, but that's only one step away. The reason why He commanded it is what we're looking for. Why do we abstain from work on the Sabbath day? Answer, because God did. And we stop working on the Sabbath day in solidarity with God. Exodus chapter 31, verse 12. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, Verily my Sabbaths you shall keep. It is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that does sanctify you. And of course, we heard Ezekiel cite this exact scripture in his condemnation of Israel for not doing it. You shall therefore keep the Sabbath. It is holy unto you. Every one that defiles it shall surely be put to death. Whoever does any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done. The Sabbath is a Sabbath of rest. It is holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Now, this was in a society where the administration was a Sabbatarian administration. We're all going to keep the Sabbath day. And it was such a strenuous thing that it carried the death penalty. Now, only I think really if you can understand the opposition between the Sabbath and idolatry, can you really understand why this was so crucial and where it led. He then went on to say, Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath through their generations, for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. The Hebrew word translated refreshed is interesting because it basically says he breathed. We have in our language, we take a breather. We sit down. We take a deep breath. We relax. And the interesting thing about this is that even God decided he would take a moment to rest. It wasn't because he was tired, because God doesn't get tired. I'm quite certain of that. But sometimes, even when we're not tired, we need time when we are not working to appreciate what we have worked for, to appreciate what we have created, to appreciate the things that we have done. And for you and me, we abstain from work in solidarity with God. Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. Why? Why are we supposed to do this? Here's the answer. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. When did God bless the seventh day? When did he hallow it? The word hallow, by the way, means to make something holy. He did it at creation. He made man, and the first thing he told man is, let's take the day off. He kept the Sabbath. It was the first thing, right off the bat. The Sabbath day was blessed, hallowed, set apart. Occasionally I get into arguments with people, and we have all the spin that people throw, and they want to argue with you. No, the Sabbath didn't come into existence until Moses. That before that, there's no record in the Bible that anybody ever kept the Sabbath day prior to Moses. Actually, they're careful. They say any man ever kept the Sabbath day prior to Moses because Scripture tells us plainly that God rested on the seventh day. But as far as I'm concerned, I think when you're dealing with someone who wishes to make that argument, you might as well leave them alone because they are not operating on sound principles of understanding. Basically, God hallowed it, set it apart at creation, and the reason why he commanded the Israelites to keep it had to do with creation, and it has been in existence from creation until now. Now, what are we supposed to do? I want to give you some things to think about. And I will start with Isaiah chapter 58 because it is so apropos to what I'm talking about today, which is the fact that the Sabbath is a matter of the heart. It is a matter of our intent. And God looks upon the heart, and he knows what we intend in our observance of the Sabbath, in our violations of our carelessness with the Sabbath, or in the legitimate exceptions we make. In Isaiah 58, verse 13, it says this, If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. You'll do these things. Then you will delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. Now, there's several important things I want to call your attention to in this passage. One, it is your choice whether the Sabbath is going to be a burden or a delight. It's your choice. It's a choice you're going to make from the heart. Because he said, if you will call the Sabbath a delight. So you have the option of calling it a delight or calling it a burden. Second, it is not pleasure, ways, or words that you're going to have to lay aside. The operative phrase is your own. It is your own that you have to lay aside. It is your own ways, your own words, your own pleasures that you are to lay aside on the Sabbath. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, your pleasure, call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him. Now, there's something else to think about. The Sabbath is not what identifies us. I don't know what's happened. I think it may have been back in 95 when when the Worldwide Church of God split apart and started down the road of not keeping the Sabbath, that a lot of people got into the defensive mode about the Sabbath and almost got as though the Sabbath is what defines us, the Sabbath is what makes us who we are, the Sabbath is the thing. No, the Sabbath is not what identifies us. The Sabbath identifies our God. And that's not quite the same thing. Our God is the creator of heaven and earth who rested the seventh day and hallowed it. We have sometimes, as I say, identified ourselves to the world by the Sabbath as though it was the most important thing about us. It's not. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, remember? He is the important thing to us. Now, when he makes this statement, the one thing I think we have to remember here is that it is not a day that we honor when we stop work and come to church here. We are not honoring the Sabbath day. Isaiah said that if you will call it the Sabbath, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and will honor Him. That is the thing that I think so easy to forget in the observance of the Sabbath. That it is in the observance of the Sabbath that we honor Him in this way. Now, are there certain tasks and works that have to be done on the Sabbath day? Of course there are. There's the care of the sick. There's the protection of the weak. There is the feeding of the hungry. There is the care of animals. These things have to be done. But the key in all these things is your own. We're not doing this for ourselves. We're not doing it necessarily to just make ourselves better. We're doing it because we care about the sick or the weak or the hungry. Be careful about blurring the line between what is holy and what is not. This is one of the things that God jumped all over the priests and Levites about because of the fact that they did not maintain this. When the Sabbath comes, welcome it. Welcome it. Draw a line and recognize the passage of time. Somehow in our lives, it's awfully easy for us at the end of a day to just sort of find ourselves all of a sudden in the Sabbath and not exactly be aware of the fact that when it happened, or may not even just now, oh, by the way, oops, this is Friday night, yeah, the sun's down, yes, this is the Sabbath day, I better quit this. This is not the way we are supposed to live our lives before God. If the Sabbath is a day that we worship, we don't worship the day, we worship God, and we honor Him by observance of the day, then we really ought to know when it gets here, shouldn't we? There ought to be a moment in time whenever we are aware of the fact that we have passed from the profane to the holy, from what is not holy to what is at a particular point in time. There's a curious thing about that, though. The Bible is a little bit vague about the beginning and ending of a day. We assume it's like it's sunset, that a tick of the clock, when we're able to determine astronomically that the sun, the last little bit of the sun goes below the horizon, that is the end of one day and the beginning of another. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says that the Sabbath begins at even at the going of the sun. Now you'll notice the absence of one word in what I just said to you. I didn't use the word down. The reason I didn't use the word down is because it's not in the Hebrew. The Sabbath is at the going of the sun. Well, when is the sun gone? I mean, how do you know that? I guess you can see it or you can't see it, but then it's cloudy and it's not cloudy. And if you can stand and read the newsprint of a newspaper outside, is the sun really gone, or are you still benefiting from or experiencing its light? Now, I don't really know quite into it, but I kind of think maybe God left us with this as a generality for each of us to work out, knowing the problems that we sometimes run into. We don't have to run our lives like we're on a stopwatch. You follow me? But nevertheless, He also looks on the heart and knows when you're playing games with time for your own purposes, your own pleasure, to make your own money. God also knows when you're doing that. What if you're in a strange latitude where the sun doesn't set? God looks on the heart. Figure out a solution. Stick with it. Don't play God's little acre with it, where the man who had pledged 1 acre of his ground, that all the crops, all the cotton that grew on that acre of ground was God's every year. And it seemed to produce more cotton than any other acre. So the next year, he moved God's acre to the acre that produced the least cotton, and he kept that one for himself. So guess what happened the next year? The poor acre produced all the cotton this year. Don't do that. Don't do that with your life. Don't play that game. Don't start it early one time and end it early the next time for your convenience, your pleasure, your purposes. There's no need to be a Pharisee about it. But the same thing, we need to understand that God expects us to honor Him in the Sabbath day, and it's our heart that He looks at. It's our intent. One thing also you have to understand is Sabbath does not come to everyone at the same time. Now, it pretty well does to all of us, but it doesn't come to people in, say, Pensacola, Florida, which is in this time zone, at the same time it does to people in Amarillo, also in this time zone. They can start the Sabbath a little later than people in Pensacola will start it, right? The time is different. The day is not. Each of us keep the Sabbath day as the Sabbath day comes to you. And when it comes to you, welcome it. That is to say, know that it is here, remember it, and think about it. It is a day that belongs to God. It's a day of rest. It's a day of prayer. And a day of reflection. Religious music station, and a song came on, an old familiar hymn that I was listening to, and I thought how appropriate it is. It's one we'll close with today, if the song leader can find it. Sweet Hour of Prayer. Because when you think about it, the song is about prayer. But you can so easily adapt the ideas of it to the Sabbath day. Sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of care, that bids me at my Father's throne make all my wants and wishes known. Sweet hour of prayer. The Sabbath is a day, a sweet day. But you know, I have concluded it takes a little bit of learning on our part to really understand and to grow into the Sabbath day for the sweetness that is there.